Hey, what's going on, ReFi Nation? John here. On today's episode, we've got a conversation with Jahed from Cerulean Ventures. We start off the show with a little intro on his background, his experience building products and exiting companies, getting into investing, specifically helping form the fund at Regen Network, and then raising money with Matthew Stotts at Cerulean Ventures to deploy capital at the intersection of impact and Web3. We get to take a look into some of his core mental models about how entrepreneurs should be approaching the bear market, how people should be building to minimize waste and maximize learning and throughput for customers at the end of the day. There's some really interesting insights here, especially for founders out in the space, looking to make a difference with the resources that they've got. I also really enjoyed his take on the big opportunities as a result of legislation in the EU and in the US, and an incredibly strong call to action to take these months as the market is low to build product and solve real problems for real people. So hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, we'd be very grateful if you could drop us a review, send it with some friends. Anybody who could use the call to regeneration, please do. Thanks for your time and peace be with you. Dude, really excited to talk. I remember the first time we met, I was captivated by some of the maybe unconventional takes that you have on the space. I remember specifically your kind of take on identity and anonymity was in stark contrast to mine. It really opened my eyes. Like, okay, this guy's obviously been in the space longer than I have. Like, he's got a more holistic perspective than I do. I've got a few things to learn. Maybe before we jump into some of the meat, let's start with the top. Like, I'd love to hear a bit about your professional journey and as much of your personal story as you feel is relevant in terms of like how you got into the space and the work that you're doing. Where does it feel natural to start?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. I ask the same question. People come on like, tell us your story. Where to start? Now I got to think about where to start. I think we talked about this a little bit, but maybe the formative thing for me has always been that my parents were Afghan war refugees. So that was probably like the best decision that they ever made for me was to, not stay in Afghanistan and raise me in America. Wow. So everything in my life, like I like to say from there, is basically downhill. Right? I haven't had any real problems since then. Of course, I grew up poor in the U.S., but that you never know when you're poor in the U.S. It's not nowadays. It's completely different. But I grew up in the '80s in the U.S. and this was around the time, of course, when like a decade later, you had the first internet businesses and being at the heart of technology, which is not something I was ever really connected to. And so then from there, I went to university in California, went to University of California, Irvine, studied biochemistry, actually, and molecular biology. So I didn't really, was not involved in tech, didn't do computer science, didn't do any of that. My entry in this space has always been a little, my wife calls me like the ultimate hustler, basically. So, I basically, from there, I did a master's degree in physics at the University of Illinois, and was like, oh yeah, I want to be a professor. But, John, if you've ever been involved in academia,
nope.
Very quickly
drop out.
Very quickly, dude. Like, when you're, I started the PhD program there, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to be a professor. It's going to be great. And then I looked across the hall at my professor's life every day. And I was like, dude, this guy doesn't do science anymore, right? Like these guys are just writing grants all day. And that's not a slight against them. It's the life they chose, right? But I was like, oh, this doesn't really look like something I want to do for the next 40 years or whatever it ends up being, right?
For sure.
I was searching, in the mid-20s if you're just like, what is impact? What could be an impactful thing? I didn't even really know what that word meant, to be honest. It was just more like, because when you don't really have an idea for what that word means, then it gets usurped by, I think back to those times like 2010 or so. This is the ascent of like all the various big content marketing websites and hustle culture and all that crap. Right? So, impact becomes like, I want to be able to, I still hear this sometimes, by the way, from like pitches from entrepreneurs, like I want to impact 1 billion people in the next 20 years or whatever. Right. Like, folks who come in with stuff like that. And when you haven't really been reflexive, in terms of like internal reflection and seeing what does that actually mean for you and what you want? Then you just kind of glom onto other people's definition of that. And so I spent like the next 10 years after grad school just doing a bunch of odd stuff, but really I backed into tech because, I was in the Bay Area. And so I ended up working in product for some of the earliest companies in personalized medicine. It was basically way too early for any of them to be useful. But it was very important for me because I got to learn a lot about how to, this will probably be relevant when we get into some of the stuff in ReFi. I learned a lot of the stuff around customer development, product management, like building stuff for specific audiences, how you do research, how you do qualitative research and customer development, all that kind of stuff. I learned it because the particular couple companies I worked at were really bad at it, right? And so
building stuff people don't want sucks.
Exactly. And you're like, why does this keep happening? And then one of the like formative experiences of my early career was I went to a buddy of mine who did a behavioral science degree at Stanford and had started his own consulting firm. And he was like, I basically was like, hey, look, I'm at this company. We're seemingly building stuff that nobody really wants. How do we build better stuff? And I kind of explained the entire context, organizational structure and all that. He goes, do those guys need user experience research to begin with, number one, and probably a bunch of other stuff. They don't really get it. You should come work for me. Right. And so I was like, sure.
Okay.
Right. And he had a big contract with UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. They were designing a big population level health study that's still going today. It's called Healthy Heart. With a very first a multi-channel integrative approach. So stuff like, think this is 2012, integrating like your Garmin device, your clinic visits, all the sort of, both, wearable data and your clinical data together. And
interesting.
That was like a really great experience, man. Like I got to understand, what does an enterprise want? How can you sell into an enterprise? What are the sort of outcomes scientists and doctors are looking for? What do they trust? What don't they trust? Right? This is all like really important shit. And then from there, I'll kind of just skip through some of the other stuff. I ended up working with Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist, for a couple of years on applying his work to.
That's super cool.
Yeah, super random. Like he was just getting involved in a lot of stuff back then. He was consulting for Google. He was building his own companies. And my bit of behavioral science background with Chris York is a guy who I was working with at the time. This got me in with him. We did some cool projects together. And then fast forward a few years, I ended up being a product manager and head of product for a couple of digital health companies because this really sort of appealed to me. Like, let's use behavioral science for good. And then this kind of backs into the ReFi thing, which is that you quickly realize, I still think this is true for most digital health companies. And in the US, there are serious structural impediments to actually bringing about the kind of change that people need in the healthcare system. And almost none of them are technical or technological. And so after doing about 5 years in digital health, I was like, all right, I don't really know about this anymore. And I kind of became, I took some time off, advised some companies. I ended up co-founding one through with this fellow Mohammed Ahmed, who had started a company called Magalix, where he was a really he's a super talented guy, did a PhD in computer science and started this company to basically just apply, you think about developers and Ethereum and all that, Kubernetes was a massive developer market, still is. And he built a super simple thing to basically apply Kubernetes to apply machine learning to Kubernetes. And that was what I did for a couple of years. Probably 3 or 4 years. We sold that company last year to a UK company and to a GitOps company in the UK. And along the way, I had always kind of been involved in crypto. So I consulted for some of the earliest projects on product, actually, it turns out. Yeah. Had worked with John Light at Aragon, had ended up getting involved at Prime DAO, which some of the listeners might have seen. And just kind of building up some cred on the actual getting your hands dirty side. And now, I'd say this burgeoning ReFi space, I met the Regen Network people about 18 months ago. The key thing for me and why I ended up doing what I'm doing today is really just, I had always been interested in shared ownership. So I left out a whole bunch of stuff around platform cooperatives and shared ownership. And I think that that's really one of the major reasons why I really even got into this ReFi stuff about 18 months ago, was that it seems that when you build technology that can be managed by the people who are doing the thing, and you can co-design stakeholder incentives with them, it leads to better outcomes. And that's kind of the story of the fund, right? We want to kind of see, can we build better technology and better primitives that can include more people, more stakeholders with better incentives for better impact outcomes, basically.
Yeah, I love it. I'm glad that I heard the story, because I was earlier having a hard time reconciling like the different pieces of your contributions. Like I remember hearing from you, I think through Sarah Baxendale at Regen Network, being like, oh, you should totally talk to Jahed. He's involved in the, like the fun side of Regen Network, right? And I was like, okay. And then I saw you in Prime DAO, and I was like, what is this guy doing? Like, how is he involved in all these different things? And then obviously saw the Cerulean launch announcement with you and Matt. And yeah, it's interesting to see the thread of ownership tied into the different aspects of your contributions. And I think it's a really powerful idea. One that is, I think, core to the Web3 promise is like, if you can create networks that are co-owned by the different stakeholders, then you obviously have a better system that's more likely to deliver on its outcomes. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more around the thesis around Regen Network in particular, and then I think it'd be great to maybe give a snapshot in terms of where we are now and how this thesis is playing out, because I think Regen Network is one of those great examples of an incredibly well-considered system from end to end that's really looking at the downsides of economic incentive structures and being very long-term and careful about the choices that we make. What was your first exposure to Regen Network, and like when did you decide, okay, this is how I want to be involved in it? And what are your thoughts in terms of where they're at today?
Oh, for sure. So I think I met Gregory last summer. It was shortly after their private sale. And for me, I had been kind of developing the thesis around the fund, was specifically around shared ownership. So like, that's why you mentioned we run this podcast called The Ownership Economy, right? That's very much around how broadly distributed governance and broadly distributed ownership can kind of feed back on each other to lead to better outcomes, right? And so I ended up meeting Gregory, I think it was July or June last year. And I was like, hey, here's what I'm working on. Really cool to see what you're working on. Really, really cool to see the distributed, approach to community governance you guys have. Like, you're actually putting in the work. Tell me more about it. And so he did. And then he's like, also, we should keep in touch, because we're like, it was early days, but they're like, we've been kind of playing around with this idea of a regen ecosystem fund, right? And we're looking for a GP for it, and keep that in mind or whatever. And so, like, that aside, we've kind of expanded the view of this fund much more broadly beyond that. Like, we work really closely with Regen. We also work closely with a lot of other folks, right? So the real thing to zoom out a little bit on Regen is Regen is the community-owned registry for originating eco assets, right? That's what it is, and what it's always been, and what it wants to, and the vision it wants to achieve. And why is that important, right? Since I'm gonna pontificate, I'm gonna proselytize a bit about Regen. Basically, and everything I'm about to say, this doesn't mean that they're antagonistic with these bodies or what have you, right? There's Vera, there's the various other types of registries, Gold Standard, there's American Carbon Registry, there's Biochar Biocarbon Registry, tons of these. There's also a great paper recently was published that shows all of the players in this space and all of their standards, and it's just an amazing map of like 100,000 lines pointing every which way. But why is a community-owned registry important, and who are the stakeholders of that, right? Like, what does the polycentric governance around that look like? That is exactly what Regen is subsumed with answering and with building product for, right? On the R&D Inc. side, it's Regen Network development, right? To zoom out a bit, there's a few parties involved there too, right? There's the Regen Foundation, which kind of actually stewards a large amount of token to ensure that communities, indigenous communities, landowners, and the sort of polycentric governance on that side, scientists are all sort of incentivized and involved in the right way. There's R&D Inc. that builds the product. That's it's a public benefit corporation. And then there's a number of other folks that are involved as well who have bags of Regen, who are either in the validation side or who are in the science community side. And like I said, their vision for it is really just being the community-owned and governed registry. So that means that they see a world where if you look out, you zoom out just in the carbon space, because Regen is not all about carbon, but just in this carbon and Web3 space, right? You have, if you just name them, there's just a number of people. There's so many, but Senkin, Thallo, Green Trade. You can imagine a world where they might each have a token and they might each have upside in each other, right? Kind of like the Prime DAO's DAO to DAO sort of approach to making sure that there's a cooperative ecosystem built between a whole bunch of DAOs that are kind of moving in the same direction. Regen would like people to come in, hold a bit of Regen, build interoperability standards together, make sure that those standards are owned and governed together, that the right people are involved on the scientific side, a bunch of other things, so that you can have complete transparency in how eco credits are originated and issued, right? So like when you look at today, I'm not going to point specific fingers here, but if you wanted to see like how did something go from origination to issuance, it's pretty difficult. You've got to sift through like hundreds of pages of PDFs and track people down and all that. Like, how did this project end up start here and end up here, and why? Right? That's actually it's actually a pretty difficult question to answer. And there are entire companies built to even rate those projects, right? Like B0 and Silvera, who come around and say like, oh, well, what did those people do and how effective was it, right? So zooming back on Regen, that's the vision for Regen. Really, is to say, let's kind of make sure that all of this is governed in open data standards, that all of you who are going to be participating in interoperable marketplaces in this asset have upside and a voice in it, right?
Yeah, totally. I love hearing your take on it as well, because I think Gregory has his own flavor, and he's been one of the anchor guests on the show in the first season. And I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics to unpack, and we won't spend too much time on the Regen side, but just before giving this kind of up to date and where we are now, I'd love to get your Cosmos thesis as well, because I know that it plays pretty centrally in terms of your fund at Cerulean. And I totally raise my hand and say I'm an absolute Cosmos novice. I kind of came into the Ethereum community and haven't ventured super far out. Help me understand, the role that tech plays in your thesis at Cerulean and why you're optimistic on that above others.
Definitely. So I think it's also good to just sort of state the thesis openly first too, so that we can work backwards to like how this stuff plays into it, right? For us, we think that the last 20 years of impact work in climate and financial resilience and all that is actually a pretty resounding success when you look at it from the perspective of like public-private partnerships, from the perspective of like just a lot of the impact outcomes and measurement that have actually happened. Much of it is a success. The problem is scaling it, right? So we actually think that the tools that ReFi is building are a huge, huge part of that. And we think that we built this fund specifically because we think that we need to scale climate impact in this decade, or excuse me, speaking very bluntly, we're right? And so, right, like there's
bad moments
no other
to take a sip of water.
You look at all of the projections and you speak to the experts on this, and there's no real certainty at the end of the day about specific scenarios. It's all probability distributions, and the probability distributions are bad, right? That's to speak frankly.
And if you know stats, so it's very likely we're
exactly. And all the scenarios which there are many, are all leaning towards the bucket, right? Like there's more of them than there are all the good ones. So we think that if you need to, one of the main, which I think most ReFi folks agree with this, is that we need to start pricing and we need to build systems that actually include externalities, right? That actually internalize their entire impact on the ecosystems they are subsumed in, right? And so we think that, blockchains, distributed ledgers, whatever you want to call them, are good open source accounting systems for these things. They can be, right? That's the big thesis for it. And so we look at investing based on that thesis in three areas, right? We're really looking at, if you really want to build an economy that does this and it's global and it's at global scale and at local scale, And you need more people involved in it. You need more money involved in it, and then you need the actual solutions. So for us, that's really just infra. It could be data. It could be better user experiences, enterprise-grade wallet infrastructure, multi-party blockchain, multi-party computation, things that enable normal humans to interact with blockchains in a safe way, basically, is one of the ways we put it. And then also building the data infrastructure we need to, especially in Europe, which we can get into. There's a lot of very interesting developments in Europe around reporting, around impact claims that are all going to be very important in the next 3 years. And you need a way to get that data and make that data available and make it available for claims and auditing. And so blockchains, again, I think are going to be a big part of that. And the second part is I've given a couple talks on this year, but we need to have liquidity for these assets, and we need to have price discovery for these assets. There's a number of reasons why we don't have price discovery. A lot of this, especially in card markets, a lot of the activities happens in opaque OTC markets for very obvious incentive-related reasons, which we can get into later. I mean, I'm not, to be clear, nothing I say here is like pointing a finger at like saying, "Oh, that group bad," right? For the most part, these markets are designed to and are acting and behaving in exactly the way they were designed, right? Like if the incentives are in front of the particular actors, they take them. Some good things happen, a lot of bad things happen, right? And then lastly, we invest directly in these ReFi solutions that tie it together, that build on top of this, right? So like,
interesting.
So that's pretty much the focus.
So given those three vectors within the thesis, why does Cosmos matter?
Yeah, I think like Cosmos matters. And to be clear too, we've really clarified this recently in a lot of our outward communication and messaging. We're not a Cosmos only fund or we're basically Cosmos stands, but we do think, why is that? It's because one of the most important things we've seen in Cosmos is that you have a lot of optionality in how you want to put things together in Cosmos as a developer specifically, right? So like, to give you an example, though Atom 2.0's, I'll get into a little, mildly technical stuff with the Cosmos community, but coming out of Cosmoverse around the time of DevCon Bogota a couple months ago, there was this new proposal for how to bring more value and utility to the Atom token. And one of those things, there's a lot of things being built in the ecosystem. One of them is interchain security. And so previously, this is why the Cosmos ecosystem kind of also gets called the VC ecosystem, because a lot of things get, venture funding, because if you're going to build in Cosmos, you cannot rely on the free security of Ethereum, right? Ethereum has as of today, I think 160 or 170 billion in market cap, right? So attacking Ethereum is very inefficient, right? You gotta get at least $90 billion together if you want to do a 51% attack. That's just one vector of security, right? But for us, traditionally Cosmos, you had to come in and be like, all right, I need to bootstrap my own validator set. I need to make sure that people are incentivized to do so that my network is decentralized and hard to attack, and that there's an incentive to lock up value and drive market cap so that the network is secure. In Cosmos recently, they decided, hey, you could have it either way, my friend. Basically, they built this thing called interchain security that now enables you to rent security from the Cosmos Hub main chain, which is like a $5 billion chain right now. So a lot of projects that were previously not viable below and had to raise at least $5 to $10 million to become viable can now actually just say we can raise small amounts of money and rent security from the hub. This allows you to scale horizontally now instead of just vertically, right? And so, in addition to Cosmos, other thing we really like is that there's a lot of stuff happening on EVMs. Which EVMs were when they were first built, no one could see what would happen 8 years later. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No one could really foretell what are the exact applications. What are they going to look like? How should compute work? How should storage work? All these things, right? They just kind of not to blame them for anything. These are complex considerations. Sure. What developed in Cosmos that we like is this app chain thesis, right? So there are a number of, if someone says, how do I join the Cosmos ecosystem? Who do I talk to? What do I do? The major builders in this ecosystem will just point you to the SDK and say, hey, there it is. Everything you need to build is there. There's an IBC, inter-blockchain communication API set up, a relayer set up as well for you to share value and get value from other chains. Everything is there. Just go ahead and launch, right? And what that also means is that there are many parameters within this SDK that let you say, hey, what do I need to optimize my blockchain for, right? There are telecommunications networks live on that don't get as much play as Helium, for instance, that are live in about, I think, 30,000 homes in the rural US right now, right? I'm talking about Althea. Well, those people said, how do we actually design a blockchain incentive system around sharing wireless, or basically a mesh Wi-Fi network? What do these specifications actually have to be? There's a lot of parameters for a developer to say, great, this is what I get to play with, right? In designing my app chain to be very specific for this use case. There's another group building a Twilio app chain, right? So if you're familiar with Twilio, which is the solution for developers to basically communicate with telecoms for, say, just if you've ever went through a B2B SaaS platform and they texted you something that says confirm your identity, you use Twilio most likely, right? Yeah. So we like Cosmos for its flexibility for developers and also for this flexibility in app chains, because basically you can build immediately whatever you need and decide on what terms you can communicate with 50 other blockchains to share value, and how to pool liquidity in the main liquidity provider, Osmosis, right? So things are growing pretty rapidly in that ecosystem, and even with the massive downturns this year, there have not been many, if any, that I can recall, projects that were above, say, like 50 million or 40 million market cap, who are like, all right, we're a dead project. We have no more developers. We're going to shut this thing down.
Interesting.
So it's pretty resilient.
It's kind of holding
this.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is a very resilient ecosystem because of this.
So let me just recap what I understand, because this is helping, provide context to some of the assertions I've heard earlier. So in effect, you mentioned kind of three parts to your thesis. We basically need to invest in infrastructure, makes it easier for normal people to use the power of these tools and to, I guess, have access to these markets. The second one was, the kind of data infrastructure layer that provides the auditability and traceability of any of these claims. And then the last one is obviously like the ReFi applications that are built on top of this. And in the current landscape, you could go and build any number of these either, applications across these three strands on Polygon or an L2. You could even build it on Ethereum. But what I'm hearing is that the motivation for doing in Cosmos is that you're able to spin up an application specific blockchain whose parameters are configured for the specific use case such that it's easier to build. Is that the main thing? Is that it's easier to build, or is it also that it's a better user experience and that it's faster? Like, what are all the reasons why you choose an app specific blockchain over just building on UVM?
I think when you break down the numbers, currently the way it is, you'll pretty much get, for the most part, equal performance if you're thinking of like time to finality and all that kind of stuff across, the problem is that people compare like Polygon and Celo and building on Ethereum or Optimism or what have you to Cosmos itself, which is an incorrect comparison. Like you actually have to build your own app chain, and there are tools to simulate these types of things so you can actually decide what are the right parameters for the app you're trying to build. What is the transaction volume? What kind of compute and all that are you going to have to support? And so really what is the key to it is the freedom to build how you want. You can scale vertically, you can scale horizontally, you can build a data availability layer, which from what I could have seen, and there are some really combative podcasts out there. I can send you one in the show notes. There was one on the Defiant where the co-founder of what is this escaping? The data availability chain. Celestia. Sorry, yeah. So the co-founder of Celestia was on the Defiant podcast. I believe it was Defiant. Delphi, sorry. Talking with one of the main developers of Ethereum's data availability layer and ZK scalability. And they just went at it for like an hour and a half. It's super funny. Okay, but but at the end of the day, John, I think the important thing to consider for Cosmos is that, especially we as a fund, we don't care where you build because you will eventually touch Cosmos at this point. It really doesn't matter. Like I point to stuff like Open Forest Protocol. Have you had them on the show? I don't remember.
Yeah, they were one of the first guests actually.
Excellent. Was it Jeremy?
No, it was actually Michael
Frederick?
And Fred.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, so I was just talking to them this week. I saw them at an event in Switzerland, and I don't think they had seen that Near is getting IBC, right? Probably within the next 3 months. So that's the inter blockchain communication. Yeah, exactly. And so like the first step to get that done, which you needed as a zero knowledge like client, or not a zero knowledge like client, just like clients on IBC on Near were that first stage passed, I think about 6 weeks ago. So they're basically very close to being IBC ready, which means that they will be able to share their ecosystem value on Regen, right? So if they originate credits and they want people to transact on Regen Network, they can, right? If Regen wants to go the other way, they can, right?
So cool.
Yeah, they can share assets, they can share messages. I'm happy to get into the IBC stuff, but people think of IBC as a bridge. It's not. It's actually just a general purpose relayer for any message, and a lot of those messages end up being tokens, right, between the ecosystems. We think that Cosmos, whether you need expedience of data availability, whether you need expedience around token secure messaging, you will touch it regardless, we think.
Totally, man. I appreciate that take. And yeah, it's been fascinating observing. We speak with a lot of founders in ReFi DAO. We've got 150 or so folks meeting every week in this cohort, and we've had quite a lot of people returning from the last one, and it's been fascinating to see the number of people diving really deep into Cosmos from I'm not sure where I'm going to build. I'm going to kind of look around and see what's up, to going, this is the most value aligned, well-architected system for, bottom up grassroots regeneration in a local context. So yeah, I'm very much keeping my eyes open. I came into this space through Bankless and was like inheriting their ETH Maxiism. And then I was kind of like, I'm just going to open my eyes and sort of see what actually is the right tool for the job, and try and support founders to make that same decision. And we've very much made that play at ReFi DAO, not being chain aligned in any way, being totally agnostic.
It is pretty funny that you mentioned Bankless, because I feel like you can't go like more than a week without seeing a new Cosmos thing come out on Bankless. It's pretty funny if you look at the last great 7 or 8 weeks of Bankless. Like, what is it? What's going on in Cosmos? Let's talk to Ethan Buckman. Let's do this, that, and the other. Right? It's pretty funny. And I think the other thing to be cognizant of, I think too, is I think that the other chains are realizing this, right? Because if you look at specifically look at Polygon, around April, they had an announcement that they would have these new Polygon supernets, right? And so Polygon supernets, when you look at what they actually are, there's a sovereign supernet, there's a validator supernet. I don't remember, there's 3 or 4 of them, but basically when you break them down, their definition, they realize that they need to give developers more flexibility in how they implement in Polygon. And they have basically built the most of the abilities that the Cosmos SDK has into this new supernet offering. And it's it's not exactly the same. I don't want people to come after me for this, but the Avalanche subnet and the Polkadot parachain are basically other implementations of this. The only difference, which is why I kind of pick on Polkadot people, is that you will have to pay rent to Polkadot for the rest of your life.
And you got to get a slot. You got to pay for it.
Exactly. Whereas in Cosmos, you can come out on Cosmos and just get interchain security and pay your validators, and that's it, right? And then when you want in the future, you want to switch off of interchain security and be your own security layer. You have enough market cap and liquidity. Great, go for it. You have the flexibility, right? That's what we really like, is that it's founder friendly. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Founder friendly, dev friendly is key. And I appreciate going into it. I think we could have a, infrastructure for regeneration pod where we bring on a panel of people with pretty diverse perspectives and hash this stuff out, because it's way more technical than I can go, but I enjoy it. Maybe we pull ourselves up a little bit to a higher level and take us to now and where we are in the ReFi space. And maybe in Web3 in general. I don't want to, cloak it to just regenerative finance, but where are we at, Jahed? Like, what is the context in which we're in? What's your advice for founders? And how do you navigate this period? Obviously, you guys are running a fund, so you kind of see everything, but be curious to get your take on around the state of ReFi.
Oh, for sure. So I think, this is not my first bear, right? And so, I think when you look around too in the last one I was just, I was dabbling here and there, right? That was my period of just really getting into the ecosystem and going what's really going on here? They say they want to build for freedom and autonomy and what have you. What does that mean? Are they actually doing it? Right. Those are the kind of questions I dealt with in the last bear. I feel like a lot of those on the value side have been, I think those have been vetted pretty well. I think a lot of very serious people actually want to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so, but now that all the funding has shriveled up, right, what do we actually really need to do? From my perspective, I can't offer much on this because I think about a lot of the experience for myself. I'm talking about on the entrepreneur side, right? Like I came up on that side in I'd say the peak of frothiness, right? In fundraising, right? It was 2017, 2018, we raised money for Magalix. And man, like those conditions may never come back, right? Like that was just a different crazy market. And so when I look around here though, I think about what are the sort of like timeless fundamentals that you will always need. And I really think that that's just, if you're sitting here thinking, what do we build for, you don't start with what, it's just, you really kind of start with like, what are the actual problems out here and who is experiencing them? And then you work back to like, what are the things that we might build, right? Because people have written entire books on this type of stuff, but it's really different when you actually get in there and try to build for them, right? Like I can pull on any number of frameworks here, right? There's there's design thinking, there's all the stuff that IDEO does, there's various, lean, this, that, and the other. But in a bear, the thing you really need to be clear, you need to remember is if you've just raised funding, amazing, good for you, fantastic. Make sure it's for the next 18 to 24 months and then you have a nice warm home for that time, right? Yeah. And in that time, you should be very much spending a bunch of it thinking it depends on how you think about it, of course, and what you're building. But if you're building a network, you got to think who are the stakeholders and how does value accrue to the network and how is value shared with them, right? And you don't need to know all these answers, but you very much need to think, you need to have some hypotheses and you need to think about how many chances are you going to have at those in the next 18 to 24 months, right? You have to think about it almost in existential terms because nobody knows when this is going to be over and everyone is going to have a stomach for, funding things again, right? By the way, that doesn't include us. We're still funding things. So if you are,
I'm just going to say, you raised the fund, bro. You got to deploy that cash. You're not sitting on it. There's inflation on the yin yang.
Yeah, absolutely. If you pay attention to any of our stuff on Twitter or on LinkedIn, we are constantly every quarter announcing our new deals. So we are still doing deals. Don't worry about that. But we're only one fund. Everyone likes to party in these things and they kind of have to distribute the risk, right? So thinking through that, you really have to think if you're building a network, what are your hypotheses around the parties and how value accrues to your network and to them and how is it shared? Because I just think that in the last 2 years, everyone, and this goes for, like you said, not just ReFi, everybody in Web3, the most precious asset, like lacking asset in a lot of the founders that I see in Web3 is that they, especially if they're building in consumer, like if they depend on regular old retail folks to participate in the network, a deep understanding of what it takes to get the attention of these folks and to actually build something that gives them value, right? Yeah. And that engages and retains them. Because you're not going to have the toolkit that many of the Web2 founders did for the last 12 years, right? Marketing attribution networks and all these other things were stood up from scratch in some of these places. Entire $100 million to $1 billion businesses were built around the data for these things. You're not going to have that. So you really have to think about, even going back earlier to the pod to stuff like Dan Ariely and behavioral economics. What's the kind of stuff that you can design with the tools at hand, like EPNS, Ethereum push notification service, things like this that can actually get people engaged with the value you're creating and do it in a way that's not just, hey, here's a notification, come do things, right? You're actually taking their perspective, if whether they're a customer or a network participant, and saying, how do I work back to something that leads to the product and is actually valuable for them? I know it sounds super remedial, but seriously, I've seen so many people just go, well, if we just build the thing and put it out there, basically what I like to call
that's how it works, right?
Yeah, right.
Then you make loads of money.
This is exactly. Then we make, this is basically like the Hopium go-to-market strategy, right?
Yeah.
We just build it. It'll live on Hopium. It'll be fine. And it's let me just show you the 90-day daily active user graphs of some of these protocols. They're terrible. They're really sad, right?
This is a face of somebody actually looking at your product. Look at the face. Yes. Don't even look at the product. Yeah. Just look at the face.
It's bad. Yeah. So very, very precious precious few, and I feel like this is a repeat of the last cycle. I remember that CryptoKitties was probably like the highest DAU product of 2018, and it was like 300 per month or something like that, right? I bet you a ton of protocols out there are sitting on even less than that, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's an interesting take. I like that you've done work with Dan Ariely. He comes from a sort of different subset of the behavior science discipline. I did some training with BJ Fogg, who's a Stanford guy. And
oh, nice.
There's a couple maxims that BJ has in his kind of behavior design principles. And I share this a lot in founder circles at office hours, especially. The first one being, help people do what they already want to do.
The purple path. Do you remember that? Yeah, you can just share the purple path thing with it. Exactly, right?
and I think it's very tempting to go the other way and to be like, oh, I want to try and pick the farmer who doesn't know anything about regeneration, and he really thinks it's great to go pick up big bags of fertilizers, and he doesn't have a smartphone, he doesn't have an internet connection. I'm going to get this guy to go regenerative agriculture, through Web3 native toolings.
I really, really want you to get that guy. I just think that if you haven't spent, if you're not an anthropologist, if you're not a UX researcher, if you haven't come from a background of actually being next to that guy in the world and understanding his problems, is going to be hard.
Right? But even if you have, if you're trying to get somebody to do something they don't want to do, unless the incentives are crazy high and the thing to do is very, very easy, which a lot of Web3 isn't, it's just the wrong target. Mm-hmm. And because there are so many people out in the world, even just from a consumer standpoint, 84% of people in the UK are very concerned about the climate, but most of them don't know what to do about it. And I'm sure there's statistics around farmers who are obviously concerned about their yield. They're concerned about inflation. They're concerned about their own outgoings to these large multinationals paying for the capital expenditure of these vehicles. Absolutely. And they want autonomy. And so I think there's a really interesting time here to really build up the entrepreneurial capacity and the ability to test hypotheses in a resource efficient way that meets user needs. And so I'm very curious to see how this pans out, because I've been a little bit surprised sometimes actually in the Web3 space of how novice some of the builders go about building things and how wasteful people are. It's just how much did you spend on testing this? And how many months did you build that thing?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It's helpful. I think it's also helpful to give I'll give some examples too, right? What have I actually done and learned in the space so maybe you could learn from an example of either what not to do or what to do, right? So when we were building that business, totally different space, right? This was about 2017, 2018. Google had released Kubernetes in 2014 as a container orchestration solution for people who are using Docker. You don't need to know what any of these things are. All you need to know is that the developer growth for Kubernetes DevOps managers went from we had 1,000 of them or something who all worked at Google in 2014 to there were quickly 100,000 in 2017, right? And then from there, it's got to be, we estimated it as something like 4 million 2 years ago, right? So there are millions of people using this and dealing with its problems in an enterprise context. So we're great. We already know there's a ton of these people. Cool. Where are they all on the internet? All right. And then, so that's kind of the next step. And then we went around and noticed that there are, 35,000, 100,000, 300,000 person user groups in Facebook. There's the Stack Exchange groups where these people congregated to share and talk about their problems, Reddit. And there was a 200,000 person Slack group run by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. So you want to talk about dirty, quick and easy, dirty user research. Participating in that Slack group was one of the best things for that business ever, because what we did was we just went in there and saw what questions did people have, what are the problems they're dealing with, and we would actually just answer them directly. And then we'd say, also, you want to see the full code implementation, all that, check our documentation. Right, here
really
it is.
Interesting.
Right, so and then from there, if we had a new product, we started to get a reputation. They would let us do this, and we asked, and it's totally fine. We would just put together a quick screener in Google Forms, free. We would say, hey, here's $75 for an hour of your time, right? And you would get in and you'd have a very strict screen around like, who's the person we think that we should be talking to, right? Which sector are they in? How many years experience do they have? All that. And then we just conduct user research with these folks. And for $750 and 10 interviews, you would de-risk the shit out of your product roadmap, right? Now it's a totally different product. A lot of ReFi folks are building, if you're building for the end user, someone who's going to get consumer payments, like the farmer you're talking about, totally different approach, right? But you can think about it in the same way though, right? Like where these folks congregate, what NGOs or what people have relationships with them that I need to build relationships with, right? That stuff takes time and not money, a lot of it, right? And if you go about it the money way, it may not be so fruitful as you pointed out, right? But really just doing that, being able to say, great, for less than $1,000 or even $500, you could go down. It really depends, right? But easily less than $1,000, I probably mitigated something like $100,000 of building risk in my product roadmap with my developers, who are very expensive and shouldn't be building the wrong thing.
Yeah, totally. And they're not even slitty devs who are going to charge you twice the whack. So it's like,
yeah, I know. It's like the market didn't even change for them.
I know it really seems it didn't. I'd be curious to get your take on kind of where this goes and what some of the key interventions are that move this from a, bare resource constrained, builders really gathering their focus and developing solutions to problems that people actually have towards the next cycle. Like, what do you think are the major unlocks?
Yeah, for sure. I think on the micro level, one of the biggest things, biggest areas, I think, especially if you're building for European companies, European customers, right, in the ReFi space, there is a lot of traction on the legislative side in your favor, right? So if you look at the various carbon legislation that's come into play over the last 15 years, people are going to have to be very accountable for their Scope 3 emissions in the EU economic area very soon. In addition, the EU is not looking at evidence anymore. For some of these things, it's not looking at like, you have to plug into this and do that and the other. You have to actually just be able to make claims, and you have to then be able to back up those claims. So I'll give you an example. I'm going on the micro here because I think there's just some interesting opportunities for folks here, right? So
yeah, it's something I know nothing about, so it's super cool.
For sure. So in the ReFi space, there are two interesting trends that are building in the EU. In the EU, one is there's this whole notion of the circular economy, which has just been like a big conference topic forever. And it was like, what the hell does this mean? What does it look like? Blah, blah, blah. Well, you are going to have to, by I believe 2025, and I can verify this, but I believe it's 2025. The EU wants to have 99% traceable single-use plastic packaging, right? Traceable and recycled. So you have to be able to say where this came from.
Wow.
99%, right? Now, the other one that's interesting is when I was talking about
the US still
claims,
wants plastic straws.
Yes. Let's just ignore the US for now. There's a reason why I live in Spain.
Sorry, keep going.
No, it's great. It's exactly on point. We should make fun of the US for that whenever we can. But I do think that the US does some other things that are, by the way, John, this is funny too. Like, the $200 billion IRA thing is going to be interesting too, which I'd love to talk about that as well. Mm-hmm. But the other thing around impact claims, right? So, have you had Tim Rand on the podcast?
Not yet, but I loved him. We're doing a roundtable with him in January, and that will be published as a pod episode. So
great. So I think he would be great for this too, to have him on as separate. But Mercy Course Ventures does a lot of interesting investments in the space around land use, land registry, and origination of commodities. Right? Mercy Corp does a lot of work there. The venture arm, I can't know if I can name these investments, so I'll keep them kind of whatever. But what you have to do in the EU is you have to be able to make a verifiable claim that a particular commodity, if it entered the EU economic area, did not result in deforestation wherever it originated. Whoa. So you're going to have to be able to. Yeah, there are a lot. This is why I keep saying the opportunities in distributed ledger, blockchain, crypto, whatever you want to call it, are really big for these types of things, right?
With DMRV, it's only possible with DMRV.
Exactly. And like what's the state of that right now? Look, I can tell you that the biggest commodities, the biggest commodities exporters across the world, Mandalay, Cargill, all these people, they have probably 100 to 1,000 person data teams who are trying to do this, and they all have failed. Like we all know they have failed. Actually, if you're on the inside of this, if you're ever on the inside of this as a ReFi, person building an impact claims marketplace or something, let me tell you, I've seen the data. They have failed, and they know they have. Right. So, what does that mean for you? It means that if you're building something here where you can provide traceability for commodities, and you can also make claims against labor rights violations and all that, you have the world's biggest $1 billion, near $1 trillion commodities exporters and food businesses ready to listen to you, right? And that's a really, really big opportunity. And I think, like, you look at that, there's so many places to intervene, right? Like when you think, okay, yet another carbon startup in Web3. What would I kind of like to see? I think there is a big opportunity in insetting. In some of these supply chains, right? Now,
let's describe the concept of insetting, because it was new to me as a Raviv Turner from Qubit, and I love this idea. It's so powerful.
That's super funny, because I am literally just like subtweeting Raviv here. Also, hi Raviv.
He's brilliant.
That's funny. Yeah. So like. Insetting, at a very, very simple clip, is just, I am one of these major multinationals like Mandalay or Cargill or what's the one, Nabisco or something, right, in the US. I have a supply chain, and I either know or don't know everything that's happening in it. Most likely don't. But I am now I have to say, what is the impact on my supply chain, right, in terms of carbon, right, under various conventions, scope 2, scope 3, what have you. Now, with that being the case, what do I actually do within my own supply chain to negate the effects of what I'm actually putting out there, right? So it could be as sort of combinatoric as doing regenerative agriculture on the side of a conventionally farmed and raised plot. It could be investing in a nature-based solution in that supply chain in a completely different place. It could be, it takes many different shapes, but you also need to be able to, like you said before at DMRV, you need to be able to say, what did I actually do? What did it result in? How many credits can I justify with it? All that kind of stuff, right? None of that really exists. It does. It's just not very good, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so coming back to kind of the full spectrum, those pieces of legislation in the EU which are causing major economic forces towards the types of impact asset issuance and verification, and also, I guess, supply chain management tools. I think there's a lot of scope there. That seems like a massive area. I mean, I'm not sure if somebody's overcome it, but the EU was at one point for a long time the largest economic area. And so these are huge opportunities. So what else? What else do you see on the horizon? Like either low-hanging fruit or big picture macro stuff that will kind of shift the needle towards the next cycle?
I think one of the other things is, I mentioned earlier, this $200 billion Inflation Reduction Act, especially like in the US, this was a big piece of legislation that passed. The other really interesting bit here is everyone is really, really focused on carbon for good reason, right? I mean, I've given like 2 or 3 talks on carbon this year and all the opportunities. That's fine. Like, I'm with you on that. But I also think that the other opportunity in carbon is renewable energy, and using, and so does the U.S. government, right? With this $200 billion IRA, there's a huge provision in there for renewable energy adoption. Yep. And so there are some really interesting opportunities here. There are a lot of builders, I'm sure, some of which I'm sure are already in ReFi DAO, but the opportunity I'm really interested in is for distributed ledgers to actually be at the point of origination of renewable energy, so that you can make claims about the exact amount that you have generated, so that you can also make claims about the exact amount that you can say you've offset by producing the energy.
This is Renewable.
Today in the market,
about to launch.
And there's a number of folks who are also working in this space as well. But like, this is a massive, massive opportunity that I want to point out. I don't think there's going to be one winner in this space, and neither does she, right? Like, and I think that there's all kinds of infrastructure that needs to be built in that market, right? So if you just focus on the Renewable side of this, they're going to be originating. They're not going to be putting the solar down itself. They'll be originating the financing for these projects on their marketplace. They'll have the data, in addition to, if they want, to be able to make impact claims for carbon offsets as well, and even issuing carbon offsets. When you look at that, then you also, like, the Renewable team and her co-founder as well, like, they come from an amazing background in these markets. They really understand them. They also realize that they may not necessarily be the entire universe of liquidity here, right? So there needs to be a bunch of infrastructure built here to make sure that there's a functioning market here between Renewables assets, between, there could be Jasmine Energy, there could be Helios DAO, there could be a number of other folks here who all sort of cooperate and share value between their various networks of origination and offsets, right? Totally. So I think it's a huge, huge opportunity. And just because I named 3 people and 3 groups building in the space, you should not be deterred. There's so many other plays with we need so much more, right? Like, I'm going to keep going a little bit here on the renewable energy side. One thing which I know a lot of people, this has been talked about for a while, and I would love to see more traction here, is greening Bitcoin. I think we need to take a responsibility for it. We need to stop pretending like Bitcoin is just bad and not our problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I get a lot of this. I get a lot of the sentiment from like ReFi folks who are like, oh yeah, but that Bitcoin thing is just whatever. No one builds on it. It's over there. It's doing its thing. I'm like, yeah, but it's still the biggest market cap thing. We should stop pretending like it doesn't exist. Right?
It drives the public sentiment.
Exactly. So we should be actively building to make almost all this hash rate green, right? That would be amazing. Nice. There's a number of ways to do that, right? There's a group I just saw, I forget their name. They're raising a $10 million Series A to use instead of flaring methane, they're going to use all of it to produce energy and not put a single like carbon molecule, a single CH4 molecule into the atmosphere from the rights and the mines they have. That's super fascinating. Then you have on the other side, there are folks who are using, this would be interesting, whatever your opinion of Cathie Wood of the ARC ETF, she wrote a white paper, she and her analyst wrote a white paper on driving renewable energy adoption with Bitcoin, right, with Bitcoin mining. And there's a very simple opportunity here, which I don't think the economics really work out yet, but I'm very interested in watching the space, is if you look at a place like along the equator, anywhere, Ecuador, Democratic Republic of Congo, whatever, you can basically design if you lay down solar there, like it's very, very profitable. The problem is that we have underdeveloped these regions of the world as Europe and America and all that. We have in many ways purposely underdeveloped them through capital flight, through, the world aid programs that actually extracted from them instead of actually helping them, to the point where their societies in these areas are not sufficiently complex to use the energy generated, right? So there's no return for investors. However, if you were to actually build a very simple smart contract that said, do I release this energy for local use? Do I store it do I use it to mine Bitcoin, or do I store it in battery? Yeah. You now have an incentive to drive the adoption of it, right? And what could be really interesting is at the same time, turning this over to community ownership on an accelerated schedule because of the Bitcoin mined, right? There could be like some kind of agreement there, because usually these things happen on 20-year PPAs, power purchase agreements, right? But because there isn't, the power purchase agreement works if there's a business, if there's, a residential area that can afford to pay for the solar. If you have the additional offshoot of Bitcoin being mined with it, it can make it a more viable project. And at the same time, it originates 100% green hash rate Bitcoin that you can sell to an enterprise. So there's a number of interesting people working in this space, like Sustainable Bitcoin Protocol. There's a number of them that are kind of just saying, how do we green Bitcoin? So that's a thing I really want to put on the radar. Everyone, I think a lot of us should be thinking about this and not just writing off Bitcoin as the stepchild over there that we're not involved with anymore.
Totally, man. I totally confess to being one of those people. It's one of those things where it's just like, it seems like an immovable force. But I 100% agree and see your point that in terms of shifting public sentiment and doing the right thing for the planet, there's a massive opportunity here, and there's a lot of waste, and we got to, greenify, electrify, decarbonize everything. And our ecosystem, needs to lead by example and have that kind of, that cultural precedent as well. So, man, we've covered a lot of ground here. I feel like this has been amazing to get inside your mind, both as an entrepreneur and a kind of a product thinker, but also to unpack your thesis and the way it's playing out in your fund. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to comment on, or any thoughts you want to share with the ReFi Nation here today before we wrap up?
Oh, yeah. I think one more, just as I think you and maybe some other folks as well had been at COP. Just one thing to point out here is that, like, the world's biggest capital allocators, which, when we're kind of just to wrap up everything in this little thing about ReFi and what we should build, the world's biggest capital allocators at COP, right? When we were at places like World Climate Summit, which is the biggest summit of public-private partnerships coming together. Mm-hmm. If you looked at their agendas for these things, they had stuff like financing nature. How do we save biodiversity in the next decade? Financing nature, financializing nature-based solutions. How do we do that more rapidly? And these are all things, one after another, John, that I was walking through these halls, I was like, these people even know that we're doing this, right? Like we can already demonstrate so much traction on some of these things, right? Like there's Simplex DNA. There's a number of other projects here who are like, how do we measure environmental DNA, and how do we like monetize and financialize biodiversity? And I think that coming out of COP, there's just a really, really big opportunity if we focus on the people who are talking about how do we get last mile payments to farmers on the ground who are, legit example, right? I was at World Climate Summit and someone was like, hey, Kenya's agricultural the Kenyan government's approach to agriculture that's very decentralized and distributed. How do we incentivize that across the world? And I'm like, my friend, I think we might have a way to do that, right? And not that I pitched Regen Network too hard. I was really thinking more of the Regen Foundation, right? There are people who like Shaila Agha, who just started there, who are very much deeply embedded with indigenous people who understand these practices, who know how to onboard technology on their terms. And I'm like, guys, this is happening, right? Like we can do this. So I think that coming out of that is just to point out that the world's biggest capital allocators have realized that they agree on many of the same problems. They even are using the language that points at some of the same solutions. So we might be in like the shittiest bear market in crypto for 4 years, but I think there's a lot of hope on the other side of it. Just if we focus on kind of meeting these folks where they are on better terms for the people we're serving, on better terms for the stakeholders that actually do the work. Yeah.
And I think also showing up to meet these people and to speak their language and to really start first from a place of understanding. I think there's a real strong testament to you showing up at COP. And I know David Rodriguez and a couple of the other main VCs in the space are like, we go to climate events. We don't go to crypto ones. It's not to say the crypto ones are bad, but if we don't break out of the echo chamber and deeply understand where the capital is coming from and what the needs are, then, I think we risk making mistakes of the past. And I'm very optimistic about this time. It's been an interesting shift for me personally. I think seeing prices crash and sentiment go with it, just recognizing that temperatures are still rising, emissions too. And, people around the world are waking up to the reality of our human condition. The time is running out. And, nation states and corporations don't seem to be capable to make the right changes to make this happen. So I'm super excited about all the people around the world listening, all the entrepreneurial energy that can go into this space, and investors like you guys who will deploy capital and take risks towards realizing return, but also making the world a better place. I really appreciate your cogent perspective on all this, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, John. I think, like you said, with the we're out of time thing, I think the only people ask me like, why did you get into VC? I thought you were this, that, and the other. And I was like, look, this is the last gasp attempt to really actually see if a complex, energy-intensive society can pay the debts that it accrues, right? If it doesn't, we're going back to a much simpler form of life until we figure out this whole energy thing. It's just the facts, right? Yeah. So
Totally. And yeah, to all those people who are already getting hit by climate, I really see this movement as needing to be built first and foremost for you. And so thanks, Jahed. Appreciate you starting with your story, man. It's been a great adventure, and looking forward to the next time that we can hang out.
Same thing, John. Thanks a lot for having me.
See you, bud.